Born in Hunan, China, Wang Jia Mei was a child like any other, curious, hopeful, and full of dreams that seemed well within her reach. Her early life was filled with moments of joy and simplicity, captured in photographs of a carefree girl smiling brightly in her school uniform. The pictures told a story of innocence, of a life just beginning to blossom. But behind the smiles lay a family grappling with its own challenges. In search of better opportunities, her parents made the difficult decision to send her to Hong Kong, believing it was a place where their daughter's potential could truly shine. When she arrived in Hong Kong as a teenager, the city was a world of contrasts, dazzling, fast-paced, and daunting all at once. For Wang Jia Mei, it was a chance to reinvent herself, to embrace a future her family had sacrificed so much for. Enrolling at Tai Po Sam Yuk Secondary School, she worked hard to find her place in a new environment. But life in Hong Kong wasn't as easy as it appeared from afar. The expectations were high, the cost of living was steep, and the isolation of being far from her family weighed heavily on her. In the beginning, she was just another teenager navigating the complexities of adolescence. Classes to attend, friendships to form, and dreams to chase. But cracks began to form in the foundation of her promising new life. Struggling academically and socially, she found herself increasingly overwhelmed. The once bright-eyed girl began to withdraw, her smiles growing less frequent, her eyes carrying the weight of unspoken worries. By the time she left school, Wang Jia Mei had already begun to feel the pressures of a world that seemed to demand more than she could give. Financial struggles loomed large, and she felt the suffocating burden of trying to stay afloat in a city where money dictated survival. Like so many young people in Hong Kong, she was drawn into a world that promised quick fixes for hard times. It was called compensated dating, a term that sounded far less dangerous than what it truly was. At first glance it seemed simple: anonymous chats, quick meetings, and envelopes of cash exchanged for companionship. For some it was just another hustle, a way to cover tuition, rent, or even family obligations. But beneath the surface, it was a perilous gamble. The anonymity of the internet masked the intentions of those on the other side of the screen, referred to the internet. What seemed like harmless transactions often came with hidden dangers, dangers that Wang Jia Mei, like so many others, couldn't fully anticipate. As she entered this shadowy world, she tried to keep her personal life separate from the choices she was forced to make. She was careful, cautious even, but the dangers of compensated dating weren't always immediately visible. The blurred faces she passed on the street, the cryptic usernames in her chatroom conversations, each interaction was a roll of the dice. For Wang Jia Mei, one of those rolls would lead to her crossing paths with someone who would change her life forever. It started as an ordinary arrangement, no different from the others, a simple exchange, a quick meeting, another bill to pay. But the messages that began to flood her phone, the subtle shifts in tone from the man on the other side, hinted at something far darker. The unease was there, but she pushed it aside. She had to. She didn't feel like she had a choice. What she didn't realize was that the man she was about to meet would bring her into a nightmare from which there was no escape. The decisions that led her to that moment, the pressures, the struggles, the compromises, were ones countless others had made, but for her, they would culminate in a horrifying end, one that no one could have foreseen. As her story begins to intersect with his, the line between ordinary and ominous blurs. A simple choice to meet someone, a choice made out of necessity, not desire, would open a door to unimaginable terror. And as we step closer to that door, the question lingers. Could anyone have saved her before it was too late? The message that brought Kiki and Ting Kai Tai together was deceptively simple. A polite inquiry sent from her phone to his, born from her need to make ends meet. But for Ting, that message was far more than an innocent invitation. It was an opportunity, a chance to indulge the darkness that had been festering within him for years. Ting Kai Tai had always been a man shaped by chaos. Born in 1984, he grew up in a world that seemed to conspire against him at every turn. His childhood was marred by tragedy when, as a young boy, he lost his mother in a car accident. That devastating event tore through his family, leaving wounds that never fully healed. Ting, just a child, was left to grapple with grief he could not understand. His father, distant and struggling with his own sorrow, offered little guidance. Ting was adrift, his pain buried but never forgotten. Then came the accident that would alter the course of Ting's life forever. At just 12 years old, he suffered a severe head injury after a fall, an incident that left him unconscious for hours. He was rushed to the hospital, where doctors worked tirelessly to stabilize him. Though he survived, the injury left lasting effects, not only physically, but emotionally. The boy, who once displayed flashes of normality, began to exhibit violent outbursts, a temper that seemed to ignite without warning. Teachers grew wary of him, classmates kept their distance, and his family struggled to cope with the changes. Diagnosed with ADHD, Ting became a regular presence in psychiatric hospitals, shuttled between doctors who attempted to manage his erratic behavior. But the treatments provided little relief. By his teenage years, Ting's life had spiraled into rebellion. Drugs became an escape, and violence a twisted form of release. The law was not far behind, and by the time he was 18, Ting had already built a criminal record, a string of petty thefts, assault charges, and drug offenses that painted a bleak picture of his future. By 2008, at the age of 24, Ting had settled into a facade of normalcy, working as a transportation worker and living in a modest apartment. But beneath that veneer, the demons of his past still lurked. He was known to friends as someone unpredictable, a man who could be charming one moment and explosively violent the next. He frequented bars, where he would drink heavily, sometimes picking fights with strangers for reasons no one could decipher. Ting was a man teetering on the edge, his darker tendencies growing stronger with each passing day. It was during this time that Ting began frequenting online chat rooms, a space where anonymity allowed him to explore his desires without judgment. The chat rooms were often filled with people looking for fleeting connections, companionship, or, in some cases, something darker. It was there, in mid-pill 2008, that Ting first encountered Kiki. Their exchange was brief but effective. Kiki, desperate for money, saw Ting as just another client. Ting, however, saw her as something else entirely. Their first meeting was transactional. Kiki arrived with the same guarded demeanor she carried to all her encounters, keeping things impersonal and efficient. Ting, on the other hand, was captivated. Her vulnerability intrigued him, and her beauty only fueled his obsession. Over the next 2 weeks, they continued to meet. Each encounter followed a similar pattern. But with every meeting, Ting's fixation on Kiki grew. Kiki, unaware of the storm brewing within him, treated Ting like any other client, polite but distant. She was focused on the money, on surviving another day, and paid little attention to the peculiarities of his behavior. But Ting was not like the others. He began asking personal questions, probing into her life in ways that made her uneasy. He wanted to know about her past, her family, her struggles. At first, Kiki brushed it off as idle curiosity. But soon, his inquiries became more intrusive. Ting's obsession began to manifest in alarming ways. He started messaging Kiki incessantly, even when they weren't scheduled to meet. His texts, at first casual, became increasingly demanding. He would ask where she was, who she was with, and why she wasn't responding. Kiki, accustomed to managing difficult clients, tried to set boundaries. But Ting didn't take rejection well. His temper, unpredictable and explosive, began to rear its head. One evening, as they sat together in his apartment, Ting's facade cracked. He spoke of his troubled past, his mother's death, his head injury, the anger that simmered within him. Kiki listened, uncomfortable but unsure of how to respond. Ting's intensity was overwhelming, and for the first time, Kiki felt a flicker of fear. She began to realize that Ting was not like the others, that there was something deeply unsettling about him. It was after one of their meetings that Ting made his intentions clear. He didn't want to be just another client, he wanted control. Kiki's independence, her ability to walk away, infuriated him. In his mind, she belonged to him now, and he would do whatever it took to keep her. Kiki, sensing the danger, tried to distance herself, but Ting was relentless. He began showing up unannounced, following her, watching her every move. The once straightforward arrangement had turned into a nightmare, and Kiki found herself trapped in Ting's web. She confided in a friend, expressing her fears, but the advice she received was dismissive. "He's just another client," they said. "Don't overthink it." But Kiki knew better. Ting's behavior was escalating, and the sense of unease that had been growing in her gut was impossible to ignore. As their paths continued to intertwine, the line between predator and prey became painfully clear. Ting's obsession with Kiki had reached a boiling point, and the man she had once seen as just another client was now a looming threat. The darkness that had followed him his entire life was about to consume her, and the horror of what lay ahead would leave a scar on Hong Kong's history forever. The city buzzed with life, amplified his inner chaos. Ting, already volatile by nature, became erratic, his mood swinging wildly between elation and aggression. Sometime past midnight, he pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, his mind clouded and frantic, fixated on Kiki. He sent her a message, his words laced with desperation. "Come over, now." Kiki, weary from the relentless demands of her clients, hesitated. She had been avoiding Ting, unsettled by his intensity and the erratic behavior he had displayed in recent weeks. But her financial struggles left her little choice. Against her better judgment, she agreed, her heart heavy with dread as she made her way to his apartment in Sham Shui Po. The narrow alley leading to Ting's building was dark and foreboding, lit only by a flickering street lamp. Kiki pulled her jacket tighter around her as she climbed the stairs, each step amplifying her unease. When Ting opened the door, his appearance startled her. His eyes were bloodshot, his movements jittery, and there was a manic energy about him that made her want to turn around and leave. But she forced a smile, stepping inside as the door clicked shut behind her. The apartment was as cramped and disheveled as she remembered, the air heavy with the stench of stale smoke and alcohol. Ting played music from a small stereo, the bass reverberating through the thin walls. He offered her food, which she accepted out of politeness, and the two sat together in uneasy silence. As the night wore on, Ting's behavior grew increasingly erratic. He spoke in disjointed sentences, his voice rising and falling unpredictably. At one point, he began ranting about his past, his mother's death, the pain of his childhood, the anger he carried like a second skin. Kiki nodded along, unsure of what to say, her discomfort growing with every passing moment. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Kiki made a chilling remark. "Sometimes I think it would be better if I weren't here anymore." The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Ting's demeanor shifted instantly, his erratic energy hardened into something darker, more menacing. He stared at Kiki, his expression unreadable, and for a moment the room fell silent, except for the low hum of the stereo. What happened next defied comprehension. In a drug-fueled haze, Ting lunged at Kiki, his hands wrapping around her throat. She struggled, clawing at his arms, her muffled cries barely audible over the music. Ting's grip tightened, his rage and delusions consuming him as he strangled her. When it was over, Kiki lay lifeless on the floor, the spark of life extinguished in an instant of horrifying violence. But Ting's madness didn't end there. His mind, warped by drugs and years of unchecked anger, refused to process what he had done. Instead, he spiraled further into darkness. Grabbing a knife from the kitchen, he dragged Kiki's lifeless body into the bathroom. What followed was a scene of unimaginable horror. Over the course of several hours, Ting methodically dismembered Kiki's body. His hands, trembling yet deliberate, worked with disturbing precision as he separated her head, arms, legs, and torso. Blood pooled on the tiled floor, its metallic scent mixing with the stench of the apartment. Ting, seemingly detached from the reality of his actions, flushed the smaller remains down the toilet, one piece at a time. When the plumbing could take no more, he turned his attention to the parts that couldn't be disposed of so easily. He placed Kiki's head and organs into a plastic bag, sealing it tightly before slipping out of the apartment under cover of darkness. The city that had once been a backdrop to Kiki's dreams now bore silent witness to Ting's crime. He traveled to the Kowloon City ferry pier, the bag heavy in his hands. The water was eerily calm as he stood at the edge, his breath visible in the cool night air. Without hesitation, he hurled the bag into the sea, watching as it disappeared beneath the surface. For Ting, the act brought no relief, no closure. He returned to his apartment, the reality of what he had done slowly beginning to sink in. The bathroom, still stained with evidence of his crime, seemed to mock him. He scrubbed at the tiles. The futility of his efforts a stark reminder that some stains could never be erased. As the hours turned into days, Ting's paranoia grew. He feared discovery, every knock at the door sending a jolt of terror through his body. But, despite his efforts to cover his tracks, the truth was beginning to unravel. And as Hong Kong slept, unaware of the horror that had unfolded in Shangshui-Po, the seeds of justice were quietly being sown. What Ting didn't know was that his crime, no matter how carefully concealed, would soon come to light. The nightmare he had created was far from over, and the echoes of his actions would reverberate through the city for years to come. The days following Kiki's disappearance were marked by an eerie quiet. In the small, dim apartment where her life had been violently stolen, Ting Kai-tai went about his routine, a hollow semblance of normalcy masking the storm within. He scrubbed the bathroom floor repeatedly, desperate to erase the physical evidence, yet unable to cleanse his mind of what he had done. The quiet droning of the television in the background seemed almost mocking as news anchors cheerfully discussed the city's daily happenings. Ting knew it was only a matter of time before the world turned its attention to him. But across the city, Kiki's family was beginning to panic. It wasn't like her to disappear without a word. For all her struggles, Kiki maintained a connection with those she cared about, and her sudden silence was deafening. When her phone went straight to voicemail for the second day in a row, her family knew something was wrong. They filed a missing persons report at the local police station. The officers, accustomed to cases of runaways and misunderstandings, initially downplayed the urgency, but Kiki's mother was insistent. Her daughter wasn't just missing, something terrible had happened. The police began their investigation, retracing Kiki's last known movements. Officers visited her usual haunts and questioned friends and acquaintances. It didn't take long for Ting's name to surface. His erratic behavior and their recent connection raised immediate red flags. Meanwhile, Ting's own world began to collapse. Consumed by paranoia, he reached out to his friend Tse Yin-tak. Over the phone, Ting rambled incoherently, his words disjointed and frantic. He spoke of cleaning up a mess and getting rid of evidence, his tone veering between fear and a strange, twisted pride. Tse, initially brushing off the calls as the ramblings of a man high on drugs, began to piece together the horrific reality. When Ting confessed outright to the murder and dismemberment, Tse was frozen in shock. He tried to reason with Ting to urge him to turn himself in, but Ting's response was chillingly matter-of-fact. "It's too late for that," he said. "I've already taken care of everything." Tse spent the next sleepless night wrestling with his conscience. The weight of what he knew pressed heavily on him, each hour amplifying the urgency of his decision. By morning, his resolve hardened. He walked into a police station and reported everything Ting had told him. This tip launched a new wave of activity in the investigation. Officers quickly obtained a warrant to search Ting's apartment. What they found inside was enough to confirm their worst fears. Despite Ting's efforts to clean the bathroom, traces of blood were discovered, seeping into grout lines and stubbornly clinging to the walls. Forensic teams worked meticulously, gathering evidence that painted a grim picture of the events that had unfolded. But Ting's arrest didn't come without its own dramatic twists. On May 9, 2008, police surrounded Ting's apartment, carefully coordinating their approach. Ting, sensing the walls closing in, attempted to flee, but his escape was cut short. Officers apprehended him on the staircase, his hoodie pulled low over his face in a futile attempt to hide his identity. Inside the interrogation room, Ting's bravado faltered. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against him and the relentless questioning of seasoned detectives, he broke. Over hours of interrogation, he confessed to everything: the argument, the murder, the dismemberment, and the disposal of Kiki's remains. The details he provided were more gruesome than anyone could have imagined. Ting described the night in chilling detail, his voice eerily detached as he recounted each step of his crime. His words painted a macabre picture of desperation, rage, and a complete disregard for human life. The confession shocked even the most hardened investigators. In their line of work, they had seen the darkest sides of humanity, but Ting's crime stood out, not just for its brutality, but for the cold, methodical way he had attempted to cover his tracks. News of Ting's arrest and confession spread quickly, sending shockwaves through Hong Kong. The city, known for its vibrant streets and bustling nightlife, was now grappling with the horror that had unfolded in its shadows. But even as Ting sat in a holding cell, the case was far from over. The police faced mounting pressure to locate Kiki's remains and piece together the timeline of her final days. The sea where Ting had discarded the plastic bag was vast, its depths an unforgiving expanse that seemed determined to keep its secrets. Divers searched tirelessly, but the waters yielded nothing. And as the trial came closer, one question loomed larger than all others. Why? Why had Ting committed such a monstrous act? Was it the drugs, his troubled past, or was there something even darker, more insidious, that had driven him to take Kiki's life? The answers were elusive, hidden in the mind of a man whose actions defied understanding. But the search for justice pressed on, the weight of Kiki's life and death driving every effort. The courtroom was filled with a tense, suffocating silence as the trial for the murder of Kiki Wang began. A year had passed since that fateful night in Sham Shui Po, but the images of Kiki's brutal death were still vivid in the minds of all who had followed the case. The air was thick with anticipation, and every eye in the room seemed fixed on the man who had taken her life, Ting Kai Tai. Seated at the defendant's table, Ting appeared disheveled, a stark contrast to the confident, almost boastful man he had been during the days following Kiki's murder. Now his eyes were vacant, as though the reality of his crime had finally begun to settle in. His lawyer attempted to argue that his actions had been influenced by his impaired mental state. They painted a picture of a man trapped in the throes of addiction, a victim of his own psychological torment. But the prosecution countered with a forceful argument, asserting that Ting had acted with calculated malice, driven by a sense of entitlement and control. The grisly details of Kiki's murder, her dismemberment, the disposal of her remains, were presented with haunting clarity. They argued that no matter the drugs, no matter his past, Ting had taken Kiki's life with full awareness of his actions. As the trial unfolded, the defense's case began to unravel. The jury listened, rapt, as they were confronted with the chilling reality of what had happened in Ting's apartment. The emotional testimony from Kiki's family, the photos of the crime scene, the details of her tragic final moments, all of it painted a portrait of a young girl who had been failed by those who should have protected her. But the most disturbing part of the trial came when the prosecution called upon the one person who could offer the clearest insight into Ting's state of mind, Yin Tak. His testimony, detailing the phone calls he had received from Ting during the dismemberment, sent shivers through the courtroom. Zi's voice cracked as he recounted the terror he felt, realizing that his friend had not only committed murder, but had done so with a level of detachment that was nothing short of horrifying. It became clear that this was no spontaneous act of violence. It was the culmination of a darker force, something deep within Ting that had always been there, lurking beneath the surface. Whether it was his mental health issues, his troubled past, or simply a soul consumed by darkness, Ting had crossed a line from which there could be no return. On July 27, 2009, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty. Ting was convicted of first-degree murder and of preventing the lawful burial of a body, a charge that reflected the gruesome nature of his attempts to dispose of Kiki's remains. The courtroom erupted into a mix of relief and sorrow, as justice had been served, but it was a hollow victory. It would never bring Kiki back. The judge's sentencing was brief but profound. Ting was sentenced to life in prison, with an additional 4 years added for the second charge. As the judge spoke, His words reverberated throughout the room. "No sentence can ever undo the harm done or return what was taken," he said solemnly. "But it is our hope that this verdict sends a message that no life is disposable, and that justice, no matter how delayed, will eventually prevail." Ting's reaction was one of indifference. He sat there, staring ahead, as if the verdict meant little to him. His face remained unreadable, void of any emotion. For all the drama, the pain, the torment of those who had been touched by Kiki's life and death, Ting's response was chillingly apathetic. Outside the courthouse, Kiki's family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Her mother, still mourning the loss of her daughter, held a picture of Kiki close to her chest. "We will never get her back," she whispered to the gathered reporters, her voice thick with sorrow. "But at least we know she has justice." The case left a lasting imprint on Hong Kong's collective conscience. It wasn't just the brutality of the crime that haunted the city. It was the underlying tragedy of a life lost too soon, a life full of promise that had been extinguished in an instant. Kiki's story was a reminder of the dangers lurking in society, of how quickly someone can be drawn into the wrong circumstances, and how fragile life truly is. As the years passed, the memory of Kiki's death remained with the city, but there were also lessons learned about the consequences of unchecked violence, the importance of mental health awareness, and the need for greater compassion for those on the margins of society. In the end, the trial of Ting Kai Tai did not just close the chapter on a horrific crime. It opened a dialogue about justice, morality, and the darkness that can sometimes dwell within us all. As the story of Kiki's life and death fades into history, one question lingers for those who hear it. What drives someone to commit such an atrocity? And how can we, as a society, prevent such tragedies from happening again? If you believe that justice must be served, that the lives of the innocent should be protected, and that no one should ever suffer the fate Kiki did, subscribe to the channel. But if you think that such acts should go unpunished, perhaps you're not ready for what true justice really means. Only those who believe the innocent should be silenced would refuse to stand with Kiki's memory. Let us know what you think in the comments, and if you believe we must take a stand against this darkness, share this video. Let the world remember, and let the truth never be forgotten.